As the First World War raged across Europe, a just as brutal civil war was tearing Russia apart. On the 17th of July 1918, 4 young women, a hemophilic boy, their near wheelchair-bound mother and their father, were awoken in the middle of the night and told to get dressed. The White Army was gaining ground and Yekaterinburg was in extreme danger. The family inside Ipatchev House had to be moved to a safer location. It was for their own good, the family's physician implored. The 6 of them were herded downstairs. The basement was small, but luckily there was just enough room for 2 chairs to be brought in. One was requested for the sickly boy and another for his mother. Both had trouble standing. The family's only solace was the muffled rumble of their getaway truck, which waited patiently just beyond the basement wall, a final link to the outside. Their underground asylum surely couldn't last long. But by the time the family finally got inside their escape truck, they were already dead, their bodies mutilated and pillaged beyond recognition. Their crime? They were the Romanovs, the disgraced rulers of the old Russia, a Russia that had been on the brink of collapse for decades, and the family's patriarch, Nicholas II, had stood back and watched it die. And the writing on the wall seemed to be written with blood. Here's the early life of Nicholas II, and this is Crown Undone. The Russia that Nicholas II inherited in 1894 was fragile. The bubbling revolutionary undercurrents and widespread social unrest of the 19th century had been pacified, but it hadn't been stamped out. It couldn't be. Nicholas's grandfather, Alexander II, had abolished serfdom in 1861 because he figured, quote, "It is better to abolish serfdom from above than to wait until the serfs begin to liberate themselves from below." The Russian system of serfdom had existed since 1649 and allowed landowners complete control over the serfs that lived and worked on their property. That was until Russia's expansionist hopes were embarrassingly quashed in the Crimean War, and suddenly military failure, food shortages, stalled industrialization, and general social unrest were seen as symptomatic of the country's decidedly biggest disease of all, serfdom, a system that surely hindered any chance of Russian progress. So, in the second year of his reign, Alexander II dramatically decided that all Russians should enjoy, quote, "the fruits of his own labours." But as was probably predictable in a country that's never really been known for its equality across class lines, the legislative changes meant that for the first few years after abolition, landowners were generously paid for their loss of land, while the ex-serfs were left to purchase expensive and often unproductive plots of land that produced very little food and even less profit. With the ex-serfs now condemned to a somewhat worse fate, at least initially, Alexander II hoped that they had been somewhat mollified. Any threat of a peasant uprising had been avoided, and the emancipated peasantry, expected to be ever grateful to the Tsar that liberated them, were primed to be an excellent population of recruits that would be the first to serve a reformed Russia on the battlefield. After Alexander II was assassinated by a bomb attack that ripped the legs from his body and tore his stomach in two, the reforms of the past 3 decades were quickly abandoned, and any hope of constitutional representation, which Alexander II was so close to signing off on, was revoked. As both of Alexander II's successors watched the Tsar bleed out in the very palace where abolition was officiated, his son, the soon-to-be Alexander III, and his grandson, Nicholas, promised themselves that they would never let the same fate befall them. After all, they were the divinely appointed leaders of Russia, and who were they to change the fate of God? As Nicholas said just 3 years into his own reign, only autocracy can save Russia, and so autocracy it was. Following Alexander III's premature death from kidney disease in 1894, Nicholas II was bequeathed a restless and dissatisfied empire, and was offered very little advice on how to run it. "What will happen to Russia now?" the floundering Nicholas II asked. "I am not yet prepared to be Tsar. I cannot govern an empire." The 26-year-old Nicholas II, somber and austere, was caught at a crossroads. On one side stood a Russia whose people demanded more liberties, better health, parliamentary representation, and on the other side stood a 300-year-old dynasty whose long-standing autocracy was supposed to have been established and protected by God himself. But as such a pious Tsar, perhaps as Michael Patterson put it, Nicholas knew, quote, it was simply his fate to stand on the fault line between the old and the new, and by actions that seemed to him reasonable at the time, help cause the earthquake. Nicholas was born on the 18th of May 1868 in Alexander Palace, just south of St. Petersburg. His mother, Maria, was the second daughter of Christian IX of Denmark. When Maria and Alexander III gave birth to their first son, Nicholas, named after Alexander's dead brother and Maria's own former lover, Alexander wrote in his diary, quote, "God sent us a son whom we named Nicholas. It is impossible to imagine. I had been weeping like a child, but suddenly my heart became light and cheerful." Nicholas grew up close to his parents and followed quite the stock standard routine as far as royal upbringings go. He'd go on yearly trips to visit his grandparents in Denmark, and he served as a junior officer in some of Imperial Russia's oldest and most revered regiments. As a 16-year-old at the St. Petersburg wedding of his uncle Grand Duke Sergei and his wife Princess Elizabeth, Nicholas watched the bride's youngest sister Alex waiting on one of the venue's pews, quiet and withdrawn. The 12-year-old princess had basically become a surrogate daughter to Britain's Queen Victoria when Alex's mother, Victoria's second eldest daughter, died of diphtheria when the young girl was just 6. Alex described her childhood before tragedy struck as a, quote, unclouded happy babyhood of perpetual sunshine, then of a great cloud. By the time Alex returned to St. Petersburg 5 years later, Nicholas was besotted, but he knew that politically the match was dangerous. Later, in 1890, when a young Nicholas sat down at his dark wooden desk to document the day's events like he always did, he wrote, quote, "This evening, Mama and I discussed the family life of today's young society people. Unintentionally, this conversation brushed a vital chord in my soul, the dream and hope that carries me from one day to the next, that I may one day marry Alex. I've loved her for a long time, but even more deeply since the winter she spent in Petersburg. I've fought my feelings for her, trying to deceive myself with the impossibility of my cherished dream coming true." On one of his early diplomatic tours in 1891, a 22-year-old Nicholas arrived in Japan with his cousin, Prince George of Greece and Denmark. Nicholas had already travelled to China, Vietnam, Sri Lanka, Singapore, Indonesia and Thailand in what his father hoped would not only be a deep learning experience, but also a chance for Nicholas to take part in the opening ceremony of the Trans-Siberian Railway, which Alexander III had decided to establish the year earlier. After nearly 2 weeks in Japan, Nicholas was taken on a tour of Otsu, a city just east of Kyoto. A procession of about 50 rickshaws with Nicholas riding at the rear was rolling through Otsu's narrow streets when suddenly one of the constables on guard jumped forward, brandished his sword and struck the heir to the Russian throne on the head. While Prince George managed to block the second blow with his cane, Nicholas was rushed back to Kyoto Imperial Palace to recover, and he was left with a 9-centimeter scar on the right side of his head. Fearing that the incident could provide a pretext for a Russian military response, Emperor Meiji himself immediately boarded a train to visit Nicholas, and tens of thousands of calling cards were sent to Nicholas's hotel by the mortified Japanese public. One young woman, Hatakayama Yuko, was riddled with such shame after the attack that she requested an audience with Nicholas to directly apologize. But when she realized the meeting would never take place, she wrote to apologize to the Russian Minister of State, sent another 2 letters to the Japanese government, and to prove her sincerity, she slit her own throat. So, just like the dragon tattoo that he had got during his visit to Japan, the Otsu incident would be imprinted in Nicholas's mind forever. By 1894, Alexander III was dying, and for the sake of a peaceful succession, Nicholas was finally granted permission to ask for Alex's hand in marriage. Since it would be a challenge to convince Alex, who had been raised as a devout Protestant, to convert to Russian Orthodoxy as required by the Russian monarchy, Nicholas spent days trying to persuade his young love. After the two reunited at another royal wedding on the 5th of April, 1894, Nicholas wrote in his diary, quote, "She has grown remarkably more beautiful, but she looked extremely sad. We talked until 12, but with no result. She still objects to conversion." That was until 3 days later, when Alex finally conceded, and Nicholas was overjoyed, scribbling in his diary that same day, quote, "The whole world changed for me in an instant. Nature, mankind, they all seem so good and dear and happy." Alexander died on the 1st of November, and Alex was quickly received into Russian Orthodoxy and took the name Alexandra Fyodorovna. With a suddenly pressing desire to wed, Nicholas insisted that the ceremony be brought forward. So, just weeks after the death of Alexander and on the same date as Nicholas's mother's birthday, the royal court couldn't possibly have known that it was organising the last ever wedding for Tsarist Russia. The official period of mourning for Alexander was temporarily interrupted on the 26th of November to celebrate the marriage of Russia's new emperor and soon-to-be empress. The cannons of the Peter and Paul fortress heralded the beginning of the understated ceremony within the Winter Palace's imperial chapel. The Danish King Christian IX, Greece's King George and Queen Olga, the Prince and Princess of Wales, and the Duke and Duchess of Saxe-Coburg-Gotha were all in attendance. Alexandra, covered in pageantry, wore a lace veil designed by her grandfather Prince Albert, a 475-carat necklace with earrings to match that had originally been owned by Catherine the Great, and finally she balanced the Romanov imperial nuptial crown atop her delicately braided hair. Nicholas and Alexandra were married with a lit candle in each of their hands at just before 1 o'clock in the afternoon. There was no reception and there was no honeymoon, and British Army officer Major General Arthur Ellis wrote to Queen Victoria that on the quote gloomy sunless day, a shadow of sadness seemed to hang over the whole ceremony, which your Majesty can well realise. Although there had been hope that a new Tsar could herald a new era of a Russian-style constitutional monarchy, just weeks after coming to the throne, a delegation of workers and peasants that arrived at the Winter Palace to request court reform were met with a stern no from the new emperor, who responded, quote, "I want everyone to know that I will devote all my strength to maintain, for the good of the whole nation, the principle of absolute autocracy, as firmly and as strongly as did my late lamented father." The official coronation period for Nicholas and Alexandra was planned for 20 days from the 6th to the 26th of May, 1896, and amid the preparation, Moscow was totally transformed. Dozens of arches, tribunes, and pavilions were erected, hundreds of thousands of lights were installed to illuminate the Kremlin, and over 8,000 pounds of table settings were transported from St. Petersburg to Moscow. But the festivities, engulfed in promise, wouldn't last long. A public feast held on the 30th of May in a field outside of Moscow, honouring the coronation, ended in a massive stampede that killed 1,389 people and left at least another 1,000 with severe injuries. The field, that had primarily been used as a military training ground, was riddled with trenches and uneven terrain, worsening the chaos and leaving many of the victims to suffocate in the displaced dirt. The bad omens that seemed to plague Nicholas's reign were only just beginning. Still, pressure was put on Nicholas to stick to his commitment to the French ambassador's gala that had been planned for the same night. So instead of visiting the victims or apologising for the day's events, Nicholas attended the lavish ball, and like his father before him, the first years of his reign saw the stringent preservation of the conservative, guarded and autocratic Tsarist Russia. The newly crowned couple's first child, Olga, was born in November 1895, Tatiana, June 1897, Maria was born in 1899, Anastasia in 1901, and finally, Alexei was born in August 1904, a boy and the desperately hoped-for heir to the Russian throne. Nicholas wrote in his diary that the day of Alexei's birth was, quote, "a great and unforgettable day for us. There are no words to thank God enough for sending us this comfort in a time of sore trials." The newborn was named Alexei after Nicholas's favourite emperor Alexis, who ruled for 30 years in the 17th century. Despite the relief that came with the birth of a male heir, Alexei was born against the backdrop of war. In a surprise attack in February that year, Japan had struck the Russian Far East Fleet at Port Arthur, at the top of Manchuria's Liaodong Peninsula. Russia had been attempting to expand southward beyond Siberia since the early 17th century, but were persistently blocked by China throughout the 18th century as most of Russia's resources were deployed against Turkey and Western Europe. By the time Alexander III came to the throne, Russia's interest in the Far East was reinvigorated, and on Nicholas's ascension, Russian expansionism in Asia became ever more active, even as Japan was emerging as an industrialized military power in the region after its victory in the First Sino-Japanese War over influence in Korea. After supporting the German Emperor Wilhelm II's decision to seize today's Qingdao in China, Nicholas II decided to annex Port Arthur himself. Russia's Minister of Communications and Finance was able to reach an agreement with China that would enable the lease of Port Arthur to Russia for 25 years. Russia continued to pour troops into Manchuria, especially under the facade of intervention in the Boxer Rebellion, which lasted from 1899 until 1901 and saw the officially sanctioned peasant uprising against foreigners in China. Without a declaration of war and in the hopes of securing an early and decisive victory to guarantee Japanese superiority in East Asia, the main Japanese fleet struck Port Arthur and imposed a blockade, trapping Russia's Far East Fleet in the harbour. It was decided that the only other Russian naval force, the Baltic Fleet, would be sent to the east, though the journey would take a grueling 9 months, by which time Port Arthur had already collapsed. Still, once the Baltic Fleet finally set out in October 1904, it was caught in a practically immediate scandal when Russian ships mistakenly fired at British civilian trawlers off the Dogger Bank, thinking that they were Japanese torpedo boats. Only an immediate apology and promise of full compensation by the Russian government prevented an all-out war between Britain and Russia. Despite Port Arthur's surrender, it was decided that the naval reinforcements offered by the Baltic Fleet should proceed, and as the Russian fleet approached southern Korea en route to Vladivostok, Japanese ships attacked, and over a course of just 2 days, 2/3 of Russia's naval force was sunk. It was a crushing defeat, and the Russo-Japanese War was concluded with the Treaty of Portsmouth, which formalised an immediate ceasefire, acknowledged Japanese claims in Korea, and demanded the evacuation of Russian troops from Manchuria. Throughout the conflict, Nicholas was largely left in the dark about the state of Russia's performance, staunchly and persistently believing in the supposed racial and technological superiority of the Russian Empire, and even during a discussion of peace terms, insisted that he would renew hostilities if the conditions of the peace were not favourable to Russia. Once the war finished in September 1905, a demoralised, economically drained and utterly humiliated Russia was teeming with a discontent unmistakably propped up by an undercurrent of revolution. And on the eve of the 1905 Russian Revolution, Nicholas Nicholas's downfall had, in retrospect, already been secured. Just as serfdom had been blamed for Russia's loss in the Crimean War, the ineptitude of Nicholas's regime became answerable for the performance of Russia in the Russo-Japanese War, and the deep and eventually violent resentment across Russia was just beginning. That was the life of Nicholas II before the revolution, and this was Crown Undone.